Hello and welcome to my channel. I am Sky and I am a VTuber, but I'm also somebody interested in historical stuff, so I have decided to informally name this the Historical Vtuber Talks. No, if you've seen my previous video, I made a video talking about halberds and poleaxes, and to be quite honest, that video does need a follow-up. To talk about all of the cases where the differences I outlined in the previous video did not really apply, and all of the cases where the terminology or the weapons are interchangeable. However, I sat down with the intention to record that video, and the more I started talking about it, the more I realized there's a whole fucking rabbit hole to go down there. So I'm definitely going to be making that video, but it's not going to be quite yet. I'm going to look more into some topics, and I'm going to make that video a follow-up to the video on a later date. However, this time I'm going to be talking about something completely different, and if you read the title, you probably already know what it is, and that is common things to think about when you're studying history and common traps that people often fall into when they're studying history. This is meant to be sort of a general framework rather than concrete examples to give to you as somebody who's interested in history. Maybe you're not interested in history, whatever. The point is to give people a framework, a baseline to work upon to actually study these topics, because it is very, very easy to go about it the wrong way, especially if you're not a qualified credential historian, but even qualified historians do things wrong sometimes. But especially people who are simply history enthusiasts who do this as a hobby have this habit of falling into the wrong types of mindset and conclusions. So in this video, I was planning to provide a framework, a good baseline of how history is and should be generally approached and studied. So without further ado, we're just going to go straight into it. So one of the primary things that needs to be kept in mind when you're studying history, and this is one of the hardest things there is to do for a modern person, but it is to not approach things out of a modern mindset. What do I mean by this? Let me elaborate. People often tend to approach things based on what makes sense to us in the modern day, and obviously it makes sense why people would do that. However, this is usually not a good idea when studying history, and the short of it is because what quote-unquote makes sense is heavily dependent on context. It depends on the general factors surrounding a specific thing you are talking about or you're researching. So if you're going to be drawing conclusions based on what makes sense to you, it is vital that you know as much as humanly possible around that topic in the first place, and usually people do not. There is so many different factors that goes into it, but the main ones that are societal factors, cultural factors, material factors, all of these things determine what makes sense and what conclusions should be drawn from researching a specific topic. For example, the material conditions are extremely different between different places in history. The cultural conditions are extremely different. The political conditions are extremely different. The societal conditions are extremely different. All of these need to be researched, need to be fully understood before somebody can start drawing conclusions and, well, speculating about a specific topic. Unfortunately, a lot of people who do speculate about a specific topic do not have a good knowledge of all of these different factors, and therefore it is easy to fall into a modern mindset. The modern mindset being, it makes sense to me, so therefore it must have made sense to them. But this is discounting the fact that you don't personally know or are affected by all of the different factors that a person in that historical context would have been affected by. I'm not saying that you cannot draw conclusions based on what makes sense, but you cannot draw conclusion based on what makes sense to you as a modern person, but rather you have to draw conclusions based on what makes sense from what is known about all of the different factors and the historical reality of the standpoint you're talking about. And if these factors are not taken into account, well, then usually conclusions drawn with the idea that it quote unquote makes sense are often going to turn out wrong. And they're not always going to turn out wrong. Sometimes they're going to turn out right. But that doesn't really matter, because without the proper framework and without the proper method of working, you're not going to have a reliable way of knowing when you're right and when you're wrong. If you use the proper framework and if you use the proper approach and the proper mindset, then you're always going to reach an answer which is, if not true, then at least closer to the truth than you would have otherwise. So another problem, which sort of ties into the previous one, is that a lot of people assume that things work similarly between various historical contexts, and usually this is not the case. For example, how things work in 13th century England might not be at all similar to how things work in 14th century France or 14th century Sweden. Or hell, sometimes even there is differences between smaller regions. For example, something working one way in a specific town in a historical kingdom does not mean it would work the same way in a different town, or even from year to year. And these differences are very important to keep in mind. Basically, if you know how something works in a very specific context, that means that you know how things work surrounding that context. But you don't necessarily apply this to other places, other time periods, and other contexts where this might not be applicable, and the way that things work has been changed. There is a ton of nuance when it comes to things like politics, when it comes to things like material reality, when it comes to things like social reality, socioeconomic reality. All of these things can vary an extreme amount, and it's a bad idea to generalize between areas which don't necessarily have those things in common. But it's really, really common for people to do this. For example, they assume, well, 13th century England had feudalism, and 14th century, I don't fucking know, France has feudalism, so it works the same way. But it really doesn't, because, well, feudalism is a whole rabbit hole in and of itself, which is quite misunderstood. And there's no such thing as a single way feudalism was set up, because feudalism is a complicated political thing which varies quite a lot depending on where and when you look. There's not a single general concept and a single general application of feudalism. And this is exactly what I'm talking about. It's not limited to just feudalism, it's limited to every single topic out there potentially. And you don't know without researching how a things work somewhere. And just because you know how things work somewhere else, you should not assume they work the same in a different context which you have not studied, because it rarely ever does. Point number 3, terminology. Modernly, we use terms in specific ways. However, one of the biggest traps that I see people fall into when talking about historical things is that they assume that the terms mean the same thing back then as they do to us. And this is a very easy trap to fall into for somebody who hasn't researched these topics. However, it is extremely important to keep in mind that usually our modern understanding of terms is not strictly correct. A lot of the terms were popularized in their modern meanings in the 18th and 19th centuries by Victorian scholars, or even in the 20th century by historians in that period. But they're not necessarily complete or, in fact, good understandings of what a term would mean in a historical text, especially when you consider that historically speaking, things were often not standardized. So a specific term can mean many different things and can be applied to different things and different concepts and different objects, depending on who the author is who's using the term, and even based on which language is being used in, because there's a lot of words, for example, that are shared between English and French, but that doesn't mean that they're used the same way necessarily between English and French. And a lot of times there's also words that are outdated and words that are newer that are coming into use, and sometimes they mean the same thing. And historians, especially during the Victorian period in the 19th-20th centuries, were working out of sort of this wrong idea that language back then was structured similarly to how language is structured for us today, and so therefore terms that are being in use have to have rigid definitions, which is not at all how it works in historical sources. The only way to properly know what is being referenced in the source you're researching is to cross-reference it with available material of the time and see if the term is described in the source you're referencing, or see if the term is described by other authors around the same time period and around the same region as the source you're referencing. And in general, try to build an understanding towards the term that way to see if there's a systematic usage of this terminology referring to what seems to be the same thing, or whether it's one of those things where, well, it means a lot of different things depending on who uses it. And this is the thing to keep in mind. Do not approach a historical text thinking you know what the terms mean, because you don't always, and the modern understanding of these terms is not always correct. It's very often, in fact, not correct. So this is a very, very important thing to keep in mind when we're researching historical sources. But the final thing I'm going to be taking up in this video is source criticism, and in general understanding the overall underlying context behind the sources you're working with. Obviously, we have access to lots of sources, especially today with the internet. We, even as people who don't necessarily study history for a living, have access to a bunch, at a ton, just like a lot. That was like 3 adjectives meaning the exact same thing, but you get the idea. We have access to tons of sources that even historians a few decades ago would have been extremely jealous of. And so we can today build a more complete understanding of various things that historians in the past could. However, that does not mean that we can just disregard source criticism altogether. In fact, source criticism is one of the most important parts of researching history. You have to understand when you're using a source, not only what the source says, but also whether what the source says is accurate, or in which ways it might be biased, in which ways it might be incorrect, in which ways it might construct a narrative rather than describing the historical reality of the time. And most historical sources do have biases in one way or another, or do have tendencies to construct narratives. I will be making a video talking more about literary conventions and artistic conventions, which I think is a hugely interesting topic. I will be making videos of those in the future. But just in general, it is important to know that just because you find a source does not mean that the source necessarily should be taken at face value without interpretation. And I'm not saying that there's a correct interpretation of all things, because many things are constantly argued and constantly discussed and controversial and whatever when it comes to interpreting in what way they should mean. However, always keep in mind that taking every source at face value is usually a bad idea. So those were the things I had outlined in this video, and these are all elementary things, but these are all things that thoroughly complicate historical research. And the unfortunate reality of the situation is that every source who seeks to generalize things will get things wrong, because proper historical research takes time. It takes months, if not years, upon looking into a very specific thing to develop an understanding about it. And if you go into something with a surface level understanding, more often than not, you're going to come out with misconceptions. You're going to come out with wrong ideas on how things work, because that's simply not how they necessarily work. So keep in mind that when you're reading or consuming media which touches upon historical topics on surface level, especially topics which don't provide any direct hardline sources, but even if they do provide some sources, this does not mean that these have a complete and full understanding of the things that they're talking about. And obviously this comes to me as well. I am presenting to you what I personally know and what I personally have researched, or what I've talked to people who have researched, and I try to build as much of a complete understanding of something as possible before I talk about it in videos. At least that's the plan. I haven't really made many. But that doesn't mean that I necessarily am always correct, and it does mean that since I am making YouTube videos, there's always going to be nuances onto a topic that I cannot capture, that I simply might have missed myself, that I cannot convey properly through a video. And when you make generalized content on a historical topic, these things will always happen. Of course, I will always try my best to provide as accurate as possible as information. However, I learn things constantly as well, which might need me to revise my previous statements, either because I didn't make myself clear enough, or because after looking more into the topic, I found out that I was wrong, or because I was given alternate interpretations that I hadn't considered, yada yada yada. These are all things that are going to influence my work, and my aim is, of course, to, as much as I can, take these things into account and correct myself where I find out that I'm wrong. But that doesn't mean that I'm going to catch everything. That doesn't mean that there won't be other people with other interpretations, and my interpretations might not always be correct where they clash with others people's. Of course, I'm going to be insisting that my interpretation makes more sense because it's the one I believe in, but you know, you're all biased towards your own things. And even though I try to reach my interpretations, which is much of research as possible, that doesn't mean I'm always right in doing it. So that was it for this video. It's going to be slightly more of a shorter one. I hope you enjoyed watching this. I hope you learned something and that you'll take these things I mentioned into account if studying history is something that you want to do, even if just as a hobby. Definitely important to keep all of these things in mind. So without further ado, I'm going to see you next time. I don't know what the next video is going to be about. Ideally, it's going to be a follow-up to the video about halberds that I made, but it might not be because I don't have a work ethic. So I'll see you all at the time.